I'll just share a few observations. I'm touched by many of my colleagues and what they've said. Each one of them resonates. As Bob mentioned, there are two things that animate a lot of what I do. I'll just share with you. One is that these days my lab works on brain tumor research, and one of our therapies got the breakthrough designation from the FDA, and we're hoping to be in the clinic. And even if we make about a small quarter of the progress that Linda's made, I'd be very thrilled to share that. The other thing I'm very excited about these days is I believe with the help of my colleagues in engineering, we have one of the more ambitious reimagining of what the undergraduate experience in education should be in engineering. And I'll tell you that story later if you'd like. For the rest of my time here, I'd like to share sort of a first-person accounting, if you will, as an immigrant, observations. First, in terms of my own personal growth, and second, my observations of this home of ours, my adopted home in the US. I have two children, and we talk of colleges, and how far do you want to go is one of those themes. And many of us, I came 8,000 miles to go to graduate school, and we shouldn't forget that the US is still the crown jewel in higher ed. But we can't take that for granted. And I came here, searching for myself, my growth as a scientist. And I'll tell you, it's fundamentally different. I did well in college in my undergrad years in India, but I was a biomedical engineering major, and I was TAing and took physiology in the Brown Medical School as a part of my requirements in graduate school. And when I was in India, I was reasonably good and physiology was a favorite subject of mine, and we had this textbook called Arthur Guyton. The physicians here probably know this. And I really knew this textbook. I was good at it, and so, in fact, I went on to TA physiology at Brown Med School. But I remember one of the first tests, it was fundamentally different how things were taught here from how I learned them. So in India, I learned how the normal was. I learned how the action potentials worked, how the EKG had the different peaks and what the distances meant and what the slopes were, but I didn't know how to stress the system. So I remember one of the tests in the GI section of physiology when I was taking course was, it's Thanksgiving dinner, you ate turkey, what happens? This is not how I learned my physiology, but it's very instructive in many ways, right? So I learned a lot about learning. The second thing I learned, I'll tell you, was how, in certain settings at least, that, people were equal. I was a first-year graduate student, not sure I wanted to do my PhD, having some doubts about, because I was transitioning from a double E type of engineer to this wet, pipetting type of engineer. Pierre Galletti was a luminary in the field, the father of artificial organs in many ways. The artificial lung is attributed to his research in many ways. He spent time at Emory also, Pierre Galletti did. And he was the vice president for research at Brown Medical School. And he was in the lab, as one of the faculty in the lab. I was in the artificial organs lab. And I remember telling him one day that I was very interested in ultrasound. In those days, I was interested in ultrasound. And this gentleman, who was probably in his 60s at that time, reads a paper on ultrasound, makes a copy of the paper himself, and puts it in my mailbox, a first-year graduate student. This was a National Academy member, founding president of AIMBY, the organization I later became president of. And my first-year grad school, he knew of my interest and would make a copy himself, not his assistant, and leave it in my mailbox. That told me something about America that I did not experience before. And so in many ways, I would also grow at Brown in other ways personally. My first black South African friend was at Brown, and he would tell me stories of this is pre-apartheid, he would tell me stories about his experience. And my world opened up in a way, India, as multicultural as it is, as diverse as it is, never was able to do that for me like US did. The world opened up in different ways for me to grow. And so that was very special for me. And I also realized when I look at my Brown and MIT experiences, and the US is not a full meritocratic society in my mind, again, going to observations. It is a mix of meritocracy and network. And for an immigrant like me who had very little connections here, the university gave me my network. Brown did and MIT did. And it's a profound role it's played in my life throughout. And we do that in some ways when we have access to Duke. When we open access to Duke, we're opening a certain portal in a certain functional and important ways. The second set of observations I'd like to share with you are my observations as an immigrant. First, I'll tell you, when you come into a new system, I had never traveled here before, as a 21-year-old who was reasonably aware, there's a bewildering range of things that you observe. Some of these, those of you who are first-generation immigrants will also agree with me. Ordering a sandwich is pretty intimidating when you first come here because there's a barrage of questions you have to answer that I was not prepared to answer, from the bread to the different sauces. I was like, So anyway. And I remember one of my first days here, I was traveling and we stopped at a McDonald's and I ordered a large Coke and I didn't realize I would get a bucket of Coke, So there are some mundane things, but there's some interesting things too. I learned that the highway system, the numbering had a logic to it. That was just like fascinating, that the even number highways are a certain way, the odd ones are a certain way. The 3-digit ones start and end or not end based on whether the first number is an odd number or an even number. I don't know if you know there's this whole world of how you number highways. There's a logic to it, there's a system to it. It's just beautiful when you understand it. But there are certain other, perhaps more important for today's conversation, observations. And I think the US, to me, having also lived in Europe for a little bit, for a year and a half, there are two things about US that I think are special to me. One is, there is, in general, a certain almost naive idealism that we are good guys. This is not to be taken for granted in the rest of the world. There is an idealism here that runs deep, that we are generally good guys. We did the right things for most part. Now, today you may question that, but there is this deep current in the US. The other part about the US that I also have learned to value a lot is that the individual matters. That for the benefit of some collective imagined, we don't throw an individual under the bus, that an individual voice matters. To me, these two principles are very, very special and in some ways unique to the US, having lived in Europe as a contrast in the West. It is not West versus East. This is uniquely American in my mind. But as I spend more time here, a more profound question arises in me. And the question is, who has the right to shape or speak to what America is? Because these are my observations. I'm not a sociologist. I'm a person living here. And I wonder then, as someone who's lived here for 30 years, or as I continue to live here and become a citizen and things, when do I have the right to speak to what America is? Do I think of America as the other, as several alluded to, or do I have a voice as well? And needless to say, the more time I spend here, the more I realize that I actually have a responsibility to contribute to what America is and the idea of America, as informed or uninformed as my position might be. And I will share with you my observation, more recent, that America is actually not very perfect. We can see that. Our Constitution is not perfect. If we look closely, that the right for women to vote was creatively adjudicated to enable that. There was no inherent right in some ways, right? So that said, it is subject to interpretation. The idea of America is subject to interpretation. And then this question I brought up earlier arises. Who gets to interpret this idea? Do we draw a line in time and say those before do? Do we draw a line by race? Do we draw a line by language? How do we draw the lines to figure out who gets to determine this? And in some ways, the answer is relatively obvious to me, that we collectively have to contribute our voice. And as Fan said, there may be some discordant notes in those, but we need to speak up and engage to collectively and actively contribute to our ideas of what America is or should be, and motivated by our experiences, whatever they are. And some of this actually, this sensitivity to social justice, I owe my wife, who's in the audience, and I'm deeply grateful because her education of me continues every day. But I really believe that it is our responsibility to think hard about us and them, because as was alluded to, yesterday's them are today's us. Today's them will be tomorrow's them, tomorrow's us. And this line continues. And to some degree, as a dean, I'll also share with you that Duke is not perfect. Duke has had a troubled history in its own way. But like America, we have a responsibility to actively contribute to shaping what Duke becomes. Events like this are important because these are ways in which we shape the conversation here. So it is easy for us to say, well, Duke shouldn't be talking about these things because students haven't been invited, or marginalized immigrants haven't been invited to this forum. And those are all valid things. We could talk about that. But we shouldn't then let cynicism win and walk away from this debate. I think it is important that we actively shape what Duke becomes. So I'll just conclude that I'm filled with gratitude more than anything else for the opportunities I've had, from Pierre Galetti to several others who've enabled me to be here, to conduct my research here, to have a career, to be selected dean of engineering. Actually, there's a wall of all the deans of Pratt School of Engineering, and I'm probably the first one of any kind of color or pigmentation. And I don't say that in any pride. I think it was a natural thing. I don't think it was a big deal to do this. It was a natural thing to pick me. But the moment is worth reflecting on, because I think while not all of America is open to a certain way of thinking, there are enough people here who resonate with the ideal of America in the way I described it, and chapters that are still being written. And my parting thought to you is, we have to step up and help write the future chapters. Our students have to step up and help write the future chapters. That we cannot cede this to those that we disagree with, because that's essentially what will happen if we don't actively set up to do this. On that note, tomorrow you may please vote if you can in Durham. There's an election going on. But thank you so much, Bob, for connecting us.